Professor of Neurological Surgery at UCSF. So he introduced me to the problem and its difficulties, and we've been struggling with it for a few years now, and so I'll talk a little bit about that struggle. Okay, so you've all seen these kinds of pictures, and there's lots and lots of machines that are collecting lots and lots of data, and we'd like to understand what on earth all that data means. And so the first meeting I had with Jeff Manley, I didn't know anything about the intensive care unit and what all these machines that go ping actually do. And so he took me around and showed me all the machines. And I said, well, suppose that you could wire all of these machines into your brain and receive all this data continuously for the entire time that the patient is in the ICU. Would you have enough information to figure out what was going on? And he said, well, you know, I've tried that. I mean, for some patients, he has sat there for 36 or 48 hours continuously with a patient and found that by doing that, he's able much better to understand what's going on than the normal procedure, which is that you show up every morning and you get a summary from the nursing staff of their hourly estimate of what they saw on the monitors. And so there's a lot of information in this data, and it's available from integration over time. A single snapshot is not going to tell you necessarily very much, but integrating over time will tell you a lot. So that's a characteristic of what we in AI and people in statistics call a partially observable system. And so a lot of this is about techniques for handling those kinds of systems. So I'll talk a little bit about the data, although actually some of the earlier talks did a great job of describing what data is available. So if you had to say, I'm at a point, I have a patient, I have to decide what to do, what's all the information that you could bring to bear on that problem? Well, any piece of data that's ever been recorded about any patient in any hospital, at any place, at any time, potentially that's all relevant stuff, right? So this is the good old-fashioned data mining view that we have lots and lots of patient records. We trawl over that data and we find exactly the piece of information or the set of information that we need to decide what to do right now. Also lots of clinical trials, only if they're disclosed. And sometimes those trials report data from individuals, in which case they're analogous to medical record data. Sometimes just aggregates, in which case they're more difficult to interpret. People just doing physiological studies and experiments, so just anatomical investigations, experiments on animals, you know, the hydrodynamics, if you like, of circulation and all the rest of it. All of this is data that could be brought to bear to help you with your current decision. And then there's the particular patient you have, everything that's gone before for that patient, what happened when they were admitted to the ICU, what was the event that caused their admission, all the scans that were done, and so on. And then everything that's been measured since they've been in the ICU. So all of this information is potentially important, and we have to be able to use it. So we're looking primarily at the traces. So this is a typical trace from the ICU. We actually just present this using GNU plot, which is a handy tool. And there's 22 variables. The ones at the top are the blood pressure, the span between systolic and diastolic in the mean, and the heart rate. The middle one, we have things like body temperature and the pulse oximetry, the oxygen saturation in the blood, which is close to 100. It's that light blue line that's very close to the top, so you can hardly see it. And then we have central venous pressure, which is the dotted blue line that kind of peters out and ends halfway across. So you can see that there's a lot of dropout in this data. There's lots of missing stuff. There's spikes everywhere. So if you look at the bottom, this is the ventilator data. So this line orange line that keeps jumping up and down is the lung compliance. And so, is the patient's lung going suddenly very, very stiff and then suddenly very, very relaxed? Or what on earth is going on with that kind of data? And then we also have all the drug data. So this is a display of the first, I guess, 23 days of drug administrations for a patient that was in the ICU for a fairly long time. So there's about 30 different drugs that were used out of about 1,000 that are potentially used in the ICU. And some of them are continuous dosage. So those are the solid bars going up and down where the dosage rate is changing. Some of them are point dosages of different sizes and so on. So just looking at this data, you can see some very interesting things. One of the things that Jeff noticed as soon as we presented him with this display, which he had never seen a display like this before, but it's quite easy to do with GNU plot, he found that for most of the patients, once they were paralyzed, they stopped getting any analgesics. And, well, why is that? Well, of course, once they're paralyzed, they can no longer be expressing any discomfort. So they obviously weren't in discomfort. Right. So here's a little close-up. This is ICP, unfortunately. Well, you can't really see it. Sorry for that. So there is, you can maybe see a very faint orange line that's jiggling up and down at very high velocity. So that's the intracranial pressure, and it's varying between 8 and about 25 to 30 at a frequency of approximately 1 to 2 minutes. Okay, so 25 to 30 is an ICP that's actually dangerous and would normally be treated by drugs. And 8 is the sort of the baseline. And so, well, what could be causing this? It's actually tapping of CSF. So you're actually removing fluid from the brain, which then causes the pressure to drop, and then you close the tap, and it very quickly ramps up again. And so there's not just the occasional intervention, right? There are interventions on the 1-minute time scale here, and they're happening all the time. So there was a study showing that the average patient in the ICU has about 300 medical procedures per day applied to them. So the data is not beautiful observational data. It's not like climate data or anything like that. There is massive intervention going on all the time. And there's also massive amounts of weird noise. So those spikes that you saw on the earlier picture in the top line, so you see there apparently blood pressure going up to 300 and dropping down to 0. So the patient is exploding and dying and exploding and dying. What's going on? Well, those are to do with recalibrating of the blood pressure sensor. When you recalibrate, you turn a dial on this transducer is recording 0 during that period. When you take a blood draw, you're turning the dial and you're exposing it to the bag, and so you're getting the pressure that's close to 300. So all of these things need to be understood. If you apply simple machine learning algorithms to this kind of data, they will just really pay attention to the weird stuff, and you won't really have a clue what's going on. And you might say, oh, well, let's just filter out the high-frequency bits. Well, in that case, you would filter out everything that's going on with the ICP here, which would be a really bad idea. There are also artifacts that take a very long time. For example, there are artifacts where the patient's lungs change in size by 40 to 50% for a period of up to an hour. And that happens on a fairly regular basis 7 or 8 times during the day. You might say, well, how could that be? And what's actually happening is the introduction of a acetylcysteine atomizer into the ventilator circuit. And the ventilator reports that as extra volume in the circuit, and therefore you believe that the patient's lungs just got a lot bigger. Okay? But that's 40 or 50 minutes, so you can't just remove the spikes and hope that that will clear up your data problem. And then the other spikes you see, so these spikes in lung compliance, a lot to do with suctioning and causing the patient's lungs to have a reaction to suctioning and all that kind of stuff. So some of these are real artifacts, some of them are pseudo artifacts, and that the patient's lungs really are doing something during those artifacts, and that may well be clinically significant. Okay, so the data is a real mess. Here's blood pressure, which is one of the simplest things to measure, you would think, right? So systolic, diastolic, mean blood pressure. On the top scan, you see the pulse pressure, which is the difference between the highest and lowest pressures, gradually diminishing. This is over, the whole thing is 4 minutes across. So over a 2-minute, you see their pulse pressure gradually diminishing and then suddenly drops to 0 and then recovers to like the heartbeat of a mouse. And you might say, oh my goodness, the patient almost died and they're going through heart failure or something. But no, it's nothing to do with that. It's probably some clog in the line, which is interfering with the measurement of pressure. The artifact on the bottom is showing that, well, goodness knows There's probably a recalibration event that causes it to go down to 0 in that little jig, but what's happening, why there's a pulse pressure while the blood pressure is apparently 230, no one has been able to figure this one out yet. So, okay, so that's the kind of data that we have to deal with. And what can you do with data to help you make a decision? So the first thing people think of when they think about machine learning is, oh, you know, we'll get lots of examples of patients and we'll find ways of predicting, you know, given the data, we'll just predict, given the data, you know, what the outcome is going to be conditioned on what treatment was applied, and that will give us treatment recommendations. And that can work very well for contexts where the patient description is fairly simple. There's a fairly small number of attributes. And patients that match or nearly match on the relevant attributes tend to have similar outcomes given similar treatments. And in the ICU, that's not really feasible, right? It's not that there's just treatment A or treatment B. The treatment is, if the patient's in there for 10 days, there are 3,000 treatments that are going to be applied. And so you've got a very large combinatorial space of things that you can do. And there's also a very complex, as we've seen, and heterogeneous set of data that describe the patient. So all of that stuff, all of those traces describe the patient up to this point. And you're not going to find another patient that looks like that or even close to that. So those are sort of practical difficulties in applying classical machine learning methods to this kind of data. There's a more basic point about applying those machine learning methods to this kind of data, which is that they ignore everything we know about the human body. They ignore what we know about physiology and medicine. And that makes their task more difficult. If you can somehow endow your machine learning algorithms with that knowledge, they should have a better chance of understanding the data. So this is not a new idea, right? People have been trying model-based techniques in medicine for quite a while. And the purpose of the model is basically to capture the first 3 categories of data that I described earlier, right? So all the medical records of all previous patients over all time, and all the clinical trials and all the physiological studies that have ever been done, in principle, can be captured in the model. And that's a nice, so the model is really just a nice shorthand for the whole history of medical experience. And you don't necessarily want to have to go and check that whole history every time you make for every single decision in the ICU for every patient. So the model captures all that. And then the specific data about this particular patient, when you combine it with a model, will help you understand the actual state of the patient and do your diagnosis and evaluate your possible treatments. So let's look at how people do modeling. So this is a little piece of a model from a paper by Guyton in 1972. It's about 10% of his model. The paper comes with a giant fold-out sort of supplement. And, you know, like when you get a magazine now and it has a big fold-out perfume thing, right? This is like a giant fold-out map of physiology that came with the journal paper. And this is one little window of that. So this is just a piece of the circulatory dynamics, and there's stuff about fluids and all, you know, lots and lots of complex subsystems of circulation in the cardiovascular system. And this constitutes about 450 differential equations in about 1,400 variables. So, and pretty much every one of those relationships is based on pulling information out of clinical studies and basic physics of circulation. And so it represents a huge amount of work, a huge amount of data went into this, but the model captures all of that medical experience.
Has this been encoded?
Yes. In fact, in silico, yes. Not in silico, because this was pre-silicon, but they built large-scale special-purpose hardware for simulating this model. And it does amazing things. So you can, for example, you can remove a kidney from the model, and you can say, okay, how long until the patient's blood pressure gets back to normal after we remove a kidney? And something like 6 weeks, you're back within 2% of normal blood pressure, right? So it's pretty amazing in terms of being able to do that kind of quantitative prediction. So why didn't this solve the problem, right? Why don't we all have these wired into our bedside monitors and doing all the reasoning for us. So several reasons. First of all, this is a single deterministic model. It doesn't correspond to the patient you have in the bed. It corresponds to some fictitious patient. Since it's a deterministic model, right, I can run it for 72 years, and I can say exactly what's going to be true of that patient in 72 years' time, right? We don't believe that, right? That doesn't make any sense, but if you buy into using deterministic models, that's what it says, if you have the initial conditions. So, no one actually took that seriously, right? They didn't say, oh, this is the model for all humans, and I'll just set the initial conditions and let it run, and I don't even need to watch the patient. So what they would typically do is run for a little while and use the data that they collect to do a least squares fit to the parameters of the model. And then say, okay, now I know the equations, and now I'm going to run it, and without needing to observe the patient anymore. And you can use it for simulating what would happen if you did different types of interventions and so on. But when you think about it, there's no amount of detail you could put into this model that would let you predict the moment of a heart attack or an aneurysm or any such event like that. Right? It simply doesn't make sense to say that we could have a model with that amount of detail where we could establish the initial conditions of the model and the parameters such that we could make that prediction. Right? So to me, there's just a fundamental impossibility of using deterministic models for dealing with real medical data. We have to allow for uncertainty in our ability to predict. And so we need probabilistic models. We can say this patient is more likely to have an aneurysm based on the age and the things we're measuring about the condition of their vascular system and their blood pressure and so on. But we can't say in 2 hours and 2 minutes and 1 second they're going to have an aneurysm. So when you look at probabilistic models of dynamical systems, what's out there? So in biology, it's quite common to use stochastic differential equations. People use that for molecular simulations. They can be quite expensive, and Chris Shelton, I think, tomorrow is going to try to convince you that they are very practical tools and can be used, and they're efficient algorithms for state estimation. So we're particularly concerned here with state estimation, right? We have a partially observable system. We want to figure out what's the state of the unseen variables that we care about. For example, in neurotrauma, it might be, is there cerebral edema, or in general ICU, is there organ failure, is there lung injury, all the things that you care about. Can you estimate those accurately and early so that you can treat them? So people might be familiar with hidden Markov models, widely used as a basis for speech recognition systems. So in a hidden Markov model, the state is a single discrete variable. And so you can't handle very, very large systems because you would simply have to have a very long list of all the possible states of the human body, which is not really a feasible way to describe what's going on. And they don't really handle continuous state variables at all. Kalman filters are very popular, and you do see that in some monitoring algorithms for ICU data. And they deal with continuous state variables, but they assume that the dynamics of the system is essentially linear with Gaussian noise. And that's highly unrealistic. Gaussian noise, for example, allows variables to range between plus and minus infinity, which is not physiologically realistic for most things. And there are a number of other limitations to how you use those. And there's a technology called dynamic Bayesian networks, or DBNs, which is what we've been using. And they generalize Kalman filters and hidden Markov models. And you can think of them as discrete time versions of stochastic differential equations. Their modeling technology is fairly well developed. There are lots and lots of examples of large-scale DBN models out there doing, for example, health monitoring for the Mars robot and things like that. So the basic way you use DBNs to do this kind of representation inference is established, and there are inference algorithms that are reasonably scalable and can let you deal with large models. So here's a little toy DBN, and let's imagine we're just trying to measure someone's heart rate. So you can see that the key variable that we're interested in is the true heart rate variable. And in DBNs, we're always very careful to distinguish between the true variable and the measurement. Okay? So the measurements are down here. We might have an ECG heart rate, and we also have a pleth heart rate. So there's two different heart rate measurements. And they're related to the true heart rate, but they're not the same as the true heart rate. For one thing, there's always small amounts of stochastic error, but there's also systematic error caused by, for example, the pleth becoming detached, or a problem with the skin in the location where you've attached it, or the ECG getting false readings from muscular stimulation and other kinds of things. We'll see examples of that in a second. Okay, we can also represent the parameters of the individual patient model. So here we might have a patient whose resting heart rate is unknown. And clearly, the resting heart rate will affect the dynamics of a true heart rate, because if the heart rate rises through exertion, for example, and then they stop exerting, the heart rate will go back down to the resting heart rate. And we don't know what that is, so we can't predict the dynamics of the true heart rate unless we know that. So we have a prior probability on distribution of resting heart rates, and then as we collect data, we may be able to infer the resting heart rate of the particular patient. Finally, there's also these variables describing the sensor state. So the patient has state, but the sensors also have state. Once the pleth falls off, it's off, and that state will persist for some time until someone reattaches it. Okay, so here's a little trace, and we seem to be having a color problem slightly. So you can see that the dotted blue line and the dotted pink line, the sort of semi-continuous lines on the top scale, those are the readings from the ECG, the blue line, and the pleth, which is the dotted pink line. So they agree with each other for the first 15 minutes or so, and then the patient started getting agitated. This is actually my grad student getting agitated. When they got agitated, I think what happened is that the muscular stimulation caused the ECG heart rate to be higher than the true reading. And so on the bottom line, you can see that the system inferred that the ECG reading was now corrupted, and so the inferred heart rate is actually closer to the pleth reading than, and it basically starts to ignore the ECG reading. And then you can see the green bars, the green error bars show the posterior distribution over the resting heart rate of the patient. So it started out with a prior whose mean was about 70, and by collecting all this data, we gradually inferred that this particular person's resting heart rate was something closer to 85, which was a big surprise, because actually he's a big, healthy guy, and we had no idea that his resting heart rate was actually quite a bit higher than normal. Okay, so here's a little bit more complicated model. This is still a caricature of what the real model will look like, but it gives you an idea. So this is a little piece of the blood pressure control mechanism. So basically at the top you have the brain, and the brain gets signals saying whether we want blood pressure to be higher or lower, and then influences the concentration of neurotransmitters, which then influence the activity of the heart and the vasculature. And then that affects the blood flow, which causes the blood pressure to do what it does. Okay, so just, you probably can't read these variables very well, so let me just blow up a few. So the heart rate and the cardiac stroke volume affect that basically defines what we mean by cardiac output. So the rate times the stroke volume is the cardiac output, and then the cardiac output and the vascular resistance combine to give you the blood pressure. Okay, so you can model all of the classical hydrodynamics of circulation in this way. Now, in addition to all these physiological state variables, we also have the sensor model. So down here at the bottom is a block that I've called the blood pressure sensor model, and I'll show you a piece of that in a second. So lots of sensor models attached to the state variables, as I've shown. We also have other pieces of physiology. So around this little subsystem, there are lots of other parts of the model that connect in various ways. So here, for example, we have a subsystem dealing with blood, and the volume of blood in the patient affects the cardiac preload. And we also have pharmacokinetics. So up here we have, for example, the concentration of phenylephrine, which affects a particular neurotransmitter in the model, and that's how it has its effect on blood pressure. So, and then this is one time slice of the model. So this represents all those state variables and sensor values at a particular time. And then at the next time step, those variables are all replicated, representing the values of the next time step. And then there are cross connections. Here, we've just shown one of those connections from the baroreceptor, which is basically how the body measures its own blood pressure, back to the brain so that the brain can get to the set point that it wants. Okay, so that's one small piece of the overall physiological model, and we've mapped out 13 subsystems, and this is one small piece of one subsystem. So it's quite a large task, and the system will end up being probably larger in scale than the one that Guyton built, but it will be quantified in terms of all of the probabilities that we need, rather than just deterministic differential equations. So this is a little idea of what the scale that we're expecting to deal with. So there's about 140 variables that you measure up front. You get up to 40 real-time sensor streams in the ICU. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that happens not on a minute-to-minute or second-to-second basis, but asynchronously. So there's about 1,000 drugs that can be administered, and those get recorded. There's lots of other care events. There are asynchronous blood gas measurements and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of measurements that can be supplied, and then our goal is somewhere on the order of 100 pathophysiological state variables that you might be interested in trying to figure out. Also things like drug concentrations. If you have a pharmacokinetic model, then you can figure out from the physiological traces actually if there was a maladministration, so someone got the wrong drug, you might be able to infer that the way the physiology is responding suggests that some other drug was supplied, not the one you said. Okay, let me talk very briefly about the blood pressure measurement just to see what a sensor model looks like. I've shown you a piece of physiology. So here's how blood pressure is measured. There's basically a line that goes into the arm, and then there's a sensor transducer, and then there's a pressure bag up the top, which is theoretically kept at pressure of 300. So when you want to measure, when you want to do a blood draw, you turn that little stopcock, and the transducer is actually at that point reading pressure from the bag. When you recalibrate, you turn the stopcock to a different setting, and the transducer is reading pressure from the atmosphere. So those are the two events that we'll talk about. This is the dynamic Bayes-Net model that describes all of those events and how they affect the kinds of readings that you're going to get. I'm not going to describe this model in detail, but you can look at it afterwards. And here's a typical trace. Right, so we've got systolic, diastolic, and mean blood pressure. And what happened here is that there's a 3-minute period during which there were a couple of blood draws going on. One of them took about 55 seconds, I think. The other one took about 30 seconds. And the system is able to infer just from these 1-minute average readings that the apparent spike in blood pressure is due to these two measurement events that took place. And it figures out how long they were. It basically then subtracts out the effect of those measurements and infers what the true blood pressure was during that interval. And you can see from the uncertainty region that during the blood draw there's more uncertainty about what the blood pressure is, but the basic trend is in fact correct. So this shows ROC curves for people who like that. So for the hypertension, so detecting hypertension in the patient, it's essentially perfect. So it's ruling out all of these spikes as fictitious. So here's just a particular example. This is 2 days of data, and maybe. Okay, so imagine, if you will, that from 180 and above, there's a large yellow region where if you go in 180 or above or 50 or below, the alarm will sound. Okay? So every time the blood pressure goes above 180 or below 50, the alarm sounds. So during this 2-day period, there are 28 alarms if you use that criterion for sounding the alarm in the ICU. Okay? Now, when we process the data and instead report the posterior average blood pressure, right, we see that this is the posterior average. And there's still a few excursions into the alarm region, which you can't see, so I'll actually point them out. There are these 12 excursions into the alarm region. And it turns out that every one of those 12 is a real alarm. In other words, this was real blood pressure and not fictitious blood pressure. So for this 2-day period on this patient, the system was perfect in eliminating artifacts from blood pressure data. Okay, so there's lots more work to do. And a point I want to make in sort of a sociological context, there's a significant lack of open source software for doing this kind of large-scale modeling. And there's also a significant lack of trainable people. There's the old computer scientists don't like to get their hands dirty with real-world problems, and medical people don't like to get their hands dirty with keyboards. And so we definitely have a training problem here. Let me just show another example of a case where the exact same methodology has been quite successful. So it's another monitoring problem, in fact, for nuclear explosions. So mankind has a tendency to let off nuclear bombs. I guess it must be fun because they've done it more than 2,000 times. And the UN has a large monitoring system designed to detect anyone who's doing this. And so we've been building software for the UN using exactly the same methods of probabilistic dynamical models. Here's the probabilistic dynamical model written out in sort of programming language style, but this is essentially the probability model that we use, and then we train all the parameters from historical data. And this is the detection failure rate. So this is how often the UN system fails to detect an event of a given magnitude. So on the x-axis is the magnitude range, and the y-axis is the detection failure rate. So this is the existing UN system, which is the result of about $100 million and 15 years of development. And this is the failure rate for the system that we built that I showed on the previous slide. So the methodology can be effective, and the more knowledge you can supply about the underlying physics of the system, the more effective this method of interpreting data can be. Okay, let me briefly talk about decisions because I'm out of time. So the purpose of collecting all this information and doing all this inference is to enable better decisions. So we want to reduce mortality, morbidity, length of stay, and so on. The problem is a very large-scale one. Right? This is not, should I do this, should I do that? At every time step, there's around 1,000 different things you could do. In fact, you could do an arbitrary subset. If you had enough needles to inject all those drugs, you could do an arbitrary subset of all these actions, right? So it's a very large action space. It's a pretty large state space. It's not enormously massive. I think the climate system is a much larger state space, even though its physics is maybe a bit simpler, but it's a very large state space. So the relevant state space for a human is maybe on the order of 1,000 state variables. We're not talking here about doing finite element analysis of blood flow in the heart or anything like that. This is at this sort of macro physiological level. And there's lots and lots of state uncertainty. So when you look at a decision problem like this, it's called a partially observable Markov decision process. And when you see that name, right, even experienced computer scientists shudder with fear because the complexity of these kinds of problems is very severe. Then when you look at how many time steps, right, what's the time scale? If you take a 1-minute time scale, which is probably the sort of minimum decision rate you could reasonably maintain, a week in the ICU is 10,000 time steps. So we're talking about a lot of decisions over a long time scale, and that makes the whole thing a very complex problem. So briefly speaking, is this hopeless? Well, I think not. And there's technology that I don't really have time to describe called hierarchical planning using partial programs. And the two basic elements are, first of all, you don't do all your planning at the individual minute-to-minute time skip, right? So when you decided to come to this conference, this is a 2-day conference, and during this conference you will do roughly 2 billion physical actions, okay, where a physical action is a muscle activation. But you don't plan at that level, right? You're not planning all 2 billion of those actions before you decide to come. You say, okay, I'm going to go to the conference. Right now you've sort of roughly committed yourself to 2 billion things. And then you figure out, okay, well, am I going to fly down or drive down? Am I going to stay at the hotel they recommend or find a cute little place by the sea? Right? So you gradually drill down your plans. And the same thing's going to happen in the ICU. And say, okay, let's figure out whether the patient's autoregulation is working. Let's try to get their blood pressure down to a safe range. Right? And these are high-level decisions. Once you've committed to that high-level decision, your decision space is now much smaller. And there's now a fairly well-understood theory of how to do efficient hierarchical planning on these kinds of timescales. So I haven't done it in the medical domain, but in other domains we've been able to look at plans over timescales of tens of thousands of time steps with even larger state spaces and action spaces than we're talking about for the ICU. So there is hope. So in conclusion, modeling is very helpful if you want to understand data. And essentially, the models are capturing all the data except for the data that's coming in from this particular patient. You have to be able to handle model uncertainty. The idea that you can observe any variable correctly is really fiction. And no matter how well you curate the data and how well you put upper and lower bounds so spurious values are eliminated, you're still going to have errors and noise whether you like it or not. I think as a modeling technology, DBNs, I don't see a fundamental problem with DBNs. Maybe Chris will convince me that we need continuous time. But there are good algorithms for doing inference, and the modeling seems to be adequate. And planning is hard. I do want to mention two other projects. So David Eddy, who's probably known to many of you as, I guess some people call him the father of evidence-based medicine, author of many guidelines on cancer screening and other things, has been, for the last 10 years or so, running a company with what he calls the Archimedes model. So it's a multi-level model, not just molecules and blood flows, but patient lifestyles and hospital, the sort of ecosystem of a hospital and the ecosystem of an entire state medical system or the VA, right? So it's a very large thing. And he has his own interesting take on how to do stochastic modeling using sort of Fourier basis decomposition of trajectories and then putting probability distribution on the coefficients of those bases. And then another project which is not yet realized, but is a very interesting snapshot into how big these things need to be, is the IT Future of Medicine project in Europe. And it's one of 6 finalists for a €1 billion grant that the EU is planning to give out. Actually, they're going to give out 2 of them, so it's a 33% chance of getting over $1 billion of funding. And it's basically this same agenda, right, to build large-scale, detailed, multi-scale models using probabilistic representation technology to get personalized medicine to be effective. Okay, I should stop there. Thank you for your attention.